Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Happy Friday, everyone. This is Marty Kaiser with our Friday edition of Real Estate Tidbits. Hope everyone is having a great week and looking forward to an awesome weekend. And I'm sure a lot of people have July 4th plans. If you're traveling, just be aware this is going to be, they say, one of the busiest July 4ths in recent history. The days that are particularly going to be busy are July 3rd through July 6th in traveling, so be aware of that. Today's podcast is going to be what I think one of the most interesting, diverse, and important ones that I've done. We've been doing podcasts now for a little over 2 years, and of course, I try to combine topics. Obviously, we focus on real estate. I usually throw a little bit about sports. And then I have societal related issues, which, frequently have what's going on with our elected officials and such. So today we're going to have basically three components. So the first one that I'm going to go over is sports, but it's going to be a little different. It's not going to be talking about who won what game and what important games are coming up and different things, but this is going to be more of a philosophical and societal thing. So what I mean by that is I've kind of headed this section, sports and intersection with social media and society. So what does that mean? Well, sports is always an important fabric in our society. It's always been a thing that kind of knocks down political bounds, racial bounds, religious bounds. People get unified in rooting for certain teams, and regardless of issues outside of sports, they have a common interest. And for example, the Knicks just won the NBA championship. It was their first title in 53 years. So you saw the city of New York really come together, and they had millions of people, and it was, for a New York standpoint, it was really pretty cool to see. New York's got a very diverse population. The new mayor is unique. He's very progressive, so people either really like what he's doing or are extremely opposed to it. But those things were all forgotten during the Knicks title run. So the reason I'm bringing this up, I always do a lot of reading and listening and thinking. And one of the things I recently found out was talking about income and how that relates to society and sports. And the person that I'm going to focus on during this comparison, so to speak, is a gentleman named Pat McAfee. Pat, for those of you that are not big sports fans, he's got a huge talk show presence on TV, on ESPN. Just to give you a little background about Pat, because it's kind of interesting, Pat was a punter for the Indianapolis Colts. And he was, during his peak seasons, he was the best punter in the league. And so, punting's a specialty item, so it doesn't get nearly the profile or the publicity. But he was an excellent punter. He led the league in punting several years. And at his peak, he was the highest paid punter in football. He was making approximately $3 to $4 million a year. And for a punter, that was a lot of money. And Pat, believe it or not, retired at the peak of his career. He actually retired when he was, I think, 29 years old. And he's been retired for about 9 years. And he, for whatever his personal reasons were, because he was still at peak skills and his health was still good and such, he just decided he'd had enough of football. And he made a transition to a unique form of media. So he started on a very small scale, kind of like with podcasts and such. And his style was totally different, very irreverent. He pretty much was very unpredictable. He would come up with different guest topics. Nothing was really forbidden from speaking about. He used a lot of colorful language. and they just edited it when it got too colorful. But, he had a unique style that was unlike anything on any of the media outlets like ESPN, any of the big sports outlets, Sirius Radio, etc. And he increasingly got very popular. And one of the things he did that was very intelligent on his part, he produced basically his own show. So when he got more popular and in demand from these different corporate entities, during the negotiations, besides negotiating how much, money he was going to make and whatever, he maintained production, control, and basically rights to the show. So basically what that meant for him was he was pretty much in total control of the show. He got a lot of autonomy. And if he didn't have a satisfactory arrangement, could ultimately leave and take his show to another venue because he owned the rights to it, where most of the personalities on ESPN don't do that. And so that happened, and he had a rapid ascent up the ladder at ESPN. So he's by far the most popular personality and show on ESPN. For years, Stephen A. Smith, who's also a very colorful personality, he was more of a debate format, and he was very popular and the highest paid person on ESPN. But Pat McAfee has surpassed him. And, there's rumors that they have a big rivalry going. But, it's hard to say from the outside what exactly that is. So just to give you an idea of Pat's success and why this is kind of revolutionary and how it ties into our society, Pat signed a new contract within the past 6 months to a year, and he's making $60 million a year. So keep that in mind from 2 points of view. I mean, besides being a lot of money, obviously, Pat is making 3 times the amount of the second highest paid person in sports media, which is Stephen A. Smith. Stephen A. Smith, who's been around for years, makes $20 million, which at the time was a record amount, and Pat McAfee's making $60 million. And Pat McAfee has much more control and ownership rights than Stephen A. Smith ever will on ESPN. And he's by far and away the highest profile sports media personality. Now, why has he gotten this much control, and why is he so popular? Well, the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 reasons, and the reason why ESPN is paying him so much and wants to maintain his presence on their network, is his listener and viewership, his irreverent style, and to a degree, the way he carries himself and his age, caters to a much younger demographic, especially younger male viewers, who ultimately are the ones that partake in a lot of not only media advertising, but usage of social media. And, that it primarily would be like the 18 to 48 range, but probably with an extremely high concentration in the 18 to 30 range. And they like Pat's personality. They like his say whatever he thinks. And, of course, he has guests that he's able to ask questions and get information from. For example, he's had Aaron Rodgers on there a bunch of times over the years. And one of the things he did that was unique with Aaron Rodgers, and what was one of the things that made his show so popular, Aaron Rodgers is a unique football personality. He's one of the great quarterbacks of all time. But he has kind of extreme views on certain things. He's not afraid to share them, and he makes political statements and such. Well, in order to get Aaron to come on his show regularly, even while he was playing, Pat McAfee came up with a unique concept. He's paying Aaron Rodgers. So supposedly he was paying Aaron Rodgers $1 million a year to appear on his show whenever Aaron was on the show. And I think I don't know if it was as much as once a week, but I know the year that Aaron Rodgers was hurt, he was on it once a week during football season. And that was something that wasn't done on these other media outlets, because normally on this Stephen A. Smith and some of the other personalities, The athletes like to be on there because it increases their brand. Just being out in the public eye, and if they're doing any promotion of products or services, that was their benefit and their motivation to be on these shows. But when Pat McAfee paid Aaron Rodgers and whoever else he's paid in the past, it put his show in a whole new format. And he had total control, So I've listened to his show some, and of course, they come up with a lot of four-letter words that are bleeped. You see their mouth moving, but you don't hear any words come out. And people like that. Now, I give him total credit for what he's done. I don't listen to his show regularly. To me, it's like a frat house show. The way guys would act in a frat house in college, drinking a lot of beer and just cutting up and, ribbing each other and cut, guys had their own way they do things in that 18 to 25 category. A lot of it's kind of immature. And that's part of the Pat McAfee show. He's got his little consortium of co-hosts that are they're there because of Pat McAfee. If it wasn't for Pat McAfee, you probably would never hear any of these guys. So he uses them as a sounding board, and of course, they're probably all making a pretty good income from being on Pat McAfee's coattails. So how does that correlate to social media? Well, two ways, really. Social media is most popular with a younger demographic, and it's completely changed the way that our society and business operates. And then also it's a way that, we have influencers and they sell products, and again, to that younger demographic. A lot of social media to me, and of course I'm older, so you might say I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I think a lot of it is for lack of a better term, crap. I don't need to know a lot of the stuff they do on social media. People that go on TikTok, some of them go on there just because they want to say whatever, they want to dance, they want to sing. A lot of them are doing it to hopefully get famous, whether it's to become famous singers, sell a product, whatever the case may be. And it's legal, so I don't criticize them for it. It's just not stuff that I need to spend my time on. My time is valuable. So when I use social media, I have a specific purpose for it, and I try to limit my use of social media. But obviously, the younger the demographic, the more interest in social media. Unfortunately, the more not indoctrination, but it's kind of an addiction with a lot of people, and a lot of people are concerned about that. Like in Great Britain recently, they put a limit on kids under a certain age can't go online there. And a lot of people think that's great. The United States will probably have a hard time passing that because we're more about freedom of rights, and it'll probably be hard to get that through. But, I think it might not be a bad thing because there's a lot of things on social media that are not in the best interest of people listening to it, especially the younger age group. But nonetheless, that's what it is. So what Pat Media's ascension and success shows is that social media is uber important, and it so much caters to the younger demographic that ESPN was willing to pay an unheard of amount to Pat McAfee. The other point of income reference is that Pat McAfee himself makes more than all but two athletes in sports, and this is on every sport. One of the sports personalities that makes more than Pat is LeBron James, and the other one is Stephen Curry. And they both happen to be in the National Basketball Association, which is basketball, of course. In basketball, the players on average tend to make more money because they have less players, and their contracts are been more generous over the years. Football, the quarterbacks at the upper echelon make close to Pat McAfee's money, and probably in the years to come will exceed that. But as long as Pat McAfee maintains his ratings and popularity, he'll probably get more contracts in the future or not. But when you think about the athletes and how much money they're making and how popular sports is, and that he makes all but two of these. And here's a guy that had no media presence, was not a big name in football, got into the transitioned out of football when he was 29 years old. He's now, I think, 38 or 39. He's actually, you've seen him on some wrestling shows. He's on college football. He's really made himself a household name. And these other venues that I'm mentioning, like college football and wrestling and stuff, you don't have the crossover that he's been able to do. Because, wrestling is really, it's glorified entertainment. It's not, it's kind of predetermined results. And Pat's not a wrestler. And if he got in a real wrestling match with these guys, they'd probably beat the crap out of him. And then on college football, it's a little bit more traditional, but he's able to kind of step outside the box, and compared to the other personalities on college football, he's much more extreme. They've got personalities as conservative as Nick Saban, who was a famous coach that's around 70 years old, that's a typical coach's personality, very no-nonsense. You'll do it my way or the highway. And then you've got Pat McAfee, who gets along well with Nick Saban, a total different personality. So he's proven that he's really analyzed society, and he's taken full advantage of that. So that's my section about sports and social media. If you have a different viewpoint, feel free to write or contact the show through one of our venues on Buzzsprout, Apple, and a lot of the other formats that we're on. The next thing I'm going to transition to is a little bit about real estate and some data. As I mentioned, I always like to go over the Hunters Creek community because it's a great frame of reference. So Hunters Creek, as of this morning, had 47 properties for sale that were single family. So it's the highest number we've had in quite some time. The asking prices of the properties range from a low of $390 to a high of $900. And so the market it fluctuates and it's unpredictable, but Hunters Creek certainly holding its own. One of the things I wanted to mention, which I went over a couple months ago, but we actually have results on this, and I thought you'd find this interesting. We had an auction home in Hunters Creek. There was a U.S. Treasury Department-owned home. I don't know much about the background, but because the U.S. Treasury owned it, I would think it was seized for one of two reasons. One was money, whether it was IRS debts or some other creative use of funds that are not looked on favorably by our U.S. government. Or maybe illegal activities were going on inside the property and they acquired the property that way. If it was a typical foreclosure, it typically would have been foreclosed by the lender, or occasionally the homeowners associations will foreclose if there's a problem with the association getting their dues paid. But because the U.S. Treasury Department owned it and put it in an auction, it had to be something more legal related. Now they set the asking price on this property at $170,000. That was kind of what I call a teaser price. There was no way it was going to sell for near that, but they wanted to put it at a low price to get a lot of interest. They had a few weeks of run up for people to view the house, and then they had an online auction. So as I mentioned when I first mentioned this house, I was interested to see what the ultimate result would be. From the way that I reviewed the home and the pictures and such, overall it had some nice features, but it did have some things that either, in my opinion, would have been changed or were lacking in the home. It did not have a pool. And so it was interesting to see what the ultimate result was. Well, it just closed last week. And keep in mind, it was asking on the initial bid $170 and up. And it ended up selling for $694. So it truly sold pretty much around market value. Now you might say, well, why would somebody pay that? Well, when they have these type of auctions, they're typically not forced auctions. So what that means, if the highest bid is not what the Treasury Department was willing to accept, they could put it for sale through different methods. But a lot of times when an auction property doesn't sell, they ultimately list it with a conventional real estate broker. But they could put it back for sale at a different auction at a later date. So there was no guarantee when the highest bid came in that the Treasury Department would accept it. But obviously it got high enough where they were probably very pleased with the result of 694. So the thing I always tell people, because I've handled a lot of foreclosures in my career, sometimes you get a really good value on foreclosures, other times you don't, or on auction properties. Auction properties, if they're handled by a skilled auctioneer, a lot of times they can drive the price up. People get in a competitive bidding format. It can be egocentric. They create a lot of excitement, and sometimes these properties sell for a lot more than you would think. So you just never know. But anyway, that was how that happened. The last and probably most unusual thing we're going to go over today, and I won't be able to go into as much detail on it as I would like due to time constraints. Plus, it's hard for me to know all the information, or anybody else for that matter, but I've tried to do as much research and give everybody a good understanding and overview of this. This is probably the most important issue we're dealing with right now, and how it ends up is going to affect future society for many years to come. And that's the Iranian conflict that we're having and the potential agreement. What they call the agreement right now is a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU. So they have some general terms that in theory they've agreed to, but it's not a binding agreement at this point. It's more like a broad outline of things that they hope to agree to. And they have an 8-week period to get this accomplished. There's a lot of doubt that anything official will be transmitted in 8 weeks or signed, because this is such not only an involved issue, but also there's like bi-daily glitches, like we still have war going on between Israel and the Hezbollah, and that some days can affect this because Hezbollah is kind of like a satellite of Iran. And then also, I believe this morning, they had a cargo ship attacked by some drones that the U.S. automatically had to blow the drones up. And all these disruptions can blow this agreement up theoretically immediately. So this agreement is very, very tenuous, and it's obviously not official. A couple things I would say about it when you kind of think of the concept: it's very ambiguous. So there's a lot of generalities that could be finalized in different ways. Both Iran and the United States are making different statements in public about a term that they're hoping to come to an agreement. So there's a completely different explanation on many of the terms. So again, this is far from a ratified agreement. There's definitely a lack of trust from both sides. The United States doesn't trust Iran, and Iran doesn't trust the United States. And it's easy for us in the United States to say, Iran's been an enemy of ours for over 45 years. They've just done some horrendous things, not only to the U.S. people, but their own society has really suffered under this dictatorship concept that they do. That being said, I can't fault Iran for not trusting us. And why do I say that? Well, I'm the most patriotic person there is. And I take the United States and trying to benefit the United States very seriously. But why do I say you can't trust us right now? Well, Donald Trump, unfortunately, with his flamboyance, he also makes conflicting statements on a weekly basis about important events. And the biggest reason I would say Iran is probably not going to trust him much is because when he took office in 2016, he ultimately, a few years after that, he unilaterally canceled the 2015 agreement that the United States under President Barack Obama had negotiated with Iran. Now, again, as citizens of the United States, unfortunately, when we have these complicated agreements, we don't know every component, and we're forced to hear media's versions. And these agreements, the one that Obama negotiated was more than 100 pages long. So obviously the media is not going to go over all that with the citizens. And so some people felt that Obama was too liberal with it. So that's subject to interpretation. But in doing my own research, when we're discussing both the 2015 agreement that Obama negotiated and the 14-point U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding, which is a preliminary framework to formally get an agreement, here's some of the things that I can say with relative confidence. The 2015 agreement was a heavily technical, comprehensive pact that was over 100 pages long. And it focused on Iran's nuclear program. In contrast, it's pretty much agreed to that the Memorandum of Understanding, which we're trying to negotiate now, was a very broad framework. Its first purpose was to end the act of war that the United States undertook with Israel against Iran. So this was pretty much, for the most part, a unilateral war, because we weren't attacking Iran because they had attacked us. We went ahead and decided to be the aggressor here. And you could argue about if that was a good idea, bad idea, the reasons for it, but that's the way it was. And so the first reason was we wanted to end the conflict. Why did we want to end the conflict other than the fact that it was a war? Well, the war was not working the way they were hoping. It created huge energy crisis worldwide. It probably, if it had kept going for a lengthy period, and still could, would throw the United States and possibly a lot of our allies into a major recession. It could create a major energy issue worldwide. So we wanted to stop that. Obviously, Iran wanted to stop the bombing of their country, because no matter how successful that was, it did create a lot of cost. It killed a lot of people. It seriously injured their infrastructure. And so, of course, when they rebuild, it's going to be a timely, time-consuming, and costly plan. However, in order to do that, they had leverage, because they learned during this conflict that they could leverage the Strait of Hormuz. And keep in mind, and this is a very important distinction between this agreement and the 2015 agreement, that was never an issue during the Obama agreement. They never leveraged that. So whether we thought that in the back of our minds or not, we never had a problem, or our allies, in shipping oil and energy products. So that was just not an issue. But once the Iranians realized that they could use that with leverage, they pretty much created a serious energy conflict that could have gotten worse, and worse. And you saw how high the energy prices were going on oil just in America. They had gone in some states to $6 or $7 a gallon. In Florida, I know myself, I had to get premium gas in my car, and at its peak, I was paying $5.50. It had gone up like $1.50 or $2 in short order. So that's one big reason why we wanted to get this settled. The 2015 agreement set strict verified caps on uranium enrichment and stockpiles. And those are the things that we're worried about for Iran developing and finalizing a nuclear weapon. The MOU, because it's still a general ambiguous concept, left those technical details to future talks. though it does require Iran from developing nuclear weapons. Keep in mind that we had the same language in the 2015 agreement. Iran had agreed to refrain from developing nuclear weapons. So this verbiage was no better than what we had in 2015. Now keep in mind a couple of big differences. This war has run us, it's stated that it's run us between $50 and $100 billion. That's a huge amount of money. And keep in mind that we had to cut health care and other things, but we're spending all this money to go to war with Iran. Secondly, during the Obama agreement, depending on what version you believe, but they had agreed to unfreeze money to Iran that was heavily criticized. And everything that I read said it was probably somewhere between $1 and $5 billion, which is a lot of money, but compared to what this memorandum of understanding states is just a trickle. Supposedly the memorandum of understanding is going to waive all U.S. oil sanctions, is going to unfreeze a lot of Iran's assets, and it's going to inject approximately $300 billion into Iran's economy. So that's huge. Now, where you're getting conflicts, among other things, is how that money can be used. We're saying there's going to be strict controls over that. There's going to be oversight by us and some peacekeeping people about how that money can be used. And the Iranians saying that's not exactly true. So it's going to be hard for that to be enforced, in my opinion. And how do we ensure that that money's not used to somehow enhance their capabilities nuclear-wise? Well, that remains to be seen. Also, one of the things that it definitely didn't address, which our 2015 deal did address, is ballistic missiles, which were a primary critique of the 2015 deal, are completely absent from the current negotiations. So it's been stated that Iran has retained about 70% of their ballistic capabilities. So they're still very well equipped to defend themselves and send missiles against all their neighboring countries, which they did to the U.S.-Iranian conflict. That was one of the things that they were pretty smart about. Once they saw that we were going to do us and Israel were going to do these aggressive things, then they said, well, we're going to put a barricade by blowing up a lot of the U.S.'s neighbors that were not involved in this conflict to put additional pressure on the U.S. to curtail those activities. And they were very effective at doing that. Now, the 2015 dispute took years to negotiate and finally had an agreed upon document. The memorandum of understanding that we have theoretically is a ceasefire that mandates a 60-day window to negotiate a permanent final deal, which again, there's a lot of skepticism that we're going to be able to finalize an agreement in 60 days. So I would say, based on the information that I've been able to ascertain and that has been disclosed, this agreement at best was no better than the 2015 agreement. So think about that for a second. If this agreement is similar to that and not better, what have we accomplished? Well, we've spent $50 billion in war efforts. We're going to give Iran $300 billion that they didn't have access to. We've put our allies more at jeopardy. We've told Iran that they have leverage with the Straits of Hormuz. They've shown our energy worldwide to be a much more fragile relationship now. And probably most importantly, Iran knows that they can pretty much ward off all these major attacks from us and Israel. The only way that we could really, and this is in my non-military opinion, put a complete halt to Iranian activities that would be not to our benefit or Israel's, is we'd have to completely demolish Iran. And I mean, that would be similar to what we did in World War II to Japan. So completely decimate their country. And of course, our weapons now are a lot stronger than they were 80 years ago. And that would mean just the demolition, not only of their country, but we'd kill millions of people. And then we don't know for sure how the Chinese and the Russians would react to that. So that could trigger, theoretically, a nuclear war. So from my perspective, and I think a lot of neutral observers, the world is much more unstable. I was particularly disappointed by, it seems like, the lack of understanding, planning, and good advice that was undertaken by Donald Trump and his administration. One of the fears I had when President Trump took office is that he was appointing people that were yes men, that wouldn't argue with him, that just wanted power and would pretty much go along with whatever he said, regardless of the negative impact on the country or the world. And I think this conflict is part and parcel of that, because you're not seeing good advice that he was received. So it's kind of, I'm very uncomfortable with it, not only for our country today, but what kind of country in the world my kids are inheriting, and down the road, my grandkids. So I have some real concerns with that. So the bottom line is, I know this may not be everybody's interest in learning about it, the Iranian-U.S. conflict, but I think it's important that you know the major components of this. I think it's important that you keep abreast of this. I think it's important that when you go to the polls, you take this into account when you vote for people. You try to find elected officials that you agree with their philosophy, but more important, that seemingly have more of a history of at least following what they tell you. When President Trump took office, he ran on a thing of not having conflicts, not going to war with people, not having these long-term situations. And even a lot of the conservative folks that voted for President Trump were really disappointed, because they feel he completely has misrepresented or lied about his intent when it came to our posture with foreign countries and our aggressive natures. So that's all for today. I hope people found this informative and interesting. And believe it or not, this is a non-political statement of mine, because as I've mentioned on previous podcasts, I think our political system is broken. I think the extremes run our country, whether they're on the right or the left. The middle ground, which represents about 75% of the United States, we don't really have a spokesperson for it. And it's doubtful that a middle ground person will get the nomination in either party, because the extremes in both parties seem to control the primary process, which is not a good thing. As you see, like New York City has an extremely progressive mayor, so you're either going to love the changes he's making or you're going to not like them. They just passed some significant additional rent control in New York City on apartments. So again, if you're a person that's struggling financially, you'll probably love that. If you're a landlord that owns real estate, you're probably going to be very much against that. So that's it for today. I hope everybody has a great weekend. Stay hydrated. Keep apprised of current events. And this is Marty Kaiser out.